Hello and welcome back. We're now going to take a look at IAM roles. So let's briefly take a look at our diagram over here. We're starting to fill in the knowledge gaps. And we can see here, like IAM policies, it's kind of the last thing we have here before we get to the S3 bucket, meaning that these are required components in order for users, or in this case with roles, either an EC2 instance or let's say a non-AWS account holder who may need temporary access to an AWS account or resource. So again, if you remember when we talked about policies, policies cannot be directly applied to other AWS services. And if you're talking about granting access to somebody that is not an IAM user, right? So granting access to somebody that does not have an IAM or AWS account, you can do that through things like federating with a SAML provider, such as Active Directory for single sign-on for temporary access. In both cases, what they need to do is assume a role. So let's jump into roles here and learn about that. And we'll click on roles over here in the console as well. And the first thing that we need to know about a role is that a role is something that another entity can assume, and in doing so acquires the specific permissions defined by the role. So in the context of this course, entities that can assume a role include AWS resources such as an EC2 instance or a non-AWS account holder who may need temporary access to an AWS resource through a service like Active Directory. Roles must be used because policies cannot be directly attached to AWS services. So I cannot take an S3 access policy and just attach it to an EC2 instance, giving that EC2 instance access to S3. So we need to do that through roles. So for example, if you're using an EC2 instance and it needs to access an S3 bucket, the instance should assume a role from IAM with the proper required permissions, those permissions being S3, let's say read-only. The instance can then perform actions based on the role it assumes, meaning it can then read from S3. You can, but should never pass or store credentials in or to an EC2 instance. So because of this, we use roles instead. Now, until recently, you could only assign a role to an EC2 instance during the EC2 instance's creation process. However, you can now assign or change a role that is assigned to an EC2 instance after the creation process via the CLI or the EC2 management console. So you no longer have to terminate an instance and recreate it if you want to change the role that is assigned to a particular EC2 instance. And also, it is important to note that an EC2 instance can only have one role attached at a time. So you can't have 2 or 3 roles attached to an EC2 instance. You can only have one role attached to an instance at any given time. So that has not changed. So you can now change a role on an EC2 instance after the instance has been created, but it can still only have one role attached. So let's talk quickly about some other uses of roles. So other users can assume a role for temporary access to AWS accounts and resources through having something like Active Directory or a single sign-on service like Facebook or Google and have them assume an identity provider access role. And we'll take a look at identity provider access roles in a second. You can also create cross-account access where a user from one account, and this being an AWS user, can assume a role with permissions in another account. So if we actually go all the way back to our main diagram here, we see here that there are 2 AWS accounts, both run by the root user, one being the production account and one being the developer account. But let's say that our developer account here, the users only assigned by IAM and our developer account somehow need access to some resource in the production account. Well, what you can do is you can have users that only have an IAM user in the developer account assume a role granting them access to services and features in the production account. So you won't actually have to create an IAM user for that specific person in the production account. You only have to have them assume a role, which is just temporary and then can easily be set for a restricted time limit to then be revoked after a certain set period of time. So again, back into IAM and into roles. Roles do have policies that are attached to them. So if you see my example here, we have an IAM role here, which is represented here by this hard hat, and a policy is attached to the role. Then the EC2 instance can assume this role, granting them access to S3. So as we could take a policy and directly attach a policy to a user, here we have to assign or attach a policy to a role, then have the EC2 instance or an outside person through an identity provider access role assume that role, thus gaining or acquiring those permissions, allowing them to access the S3 bucket. So let's take a look over here in the console on how to set that up. So clicking on roles, we can click on create new role, and we'll give this role a name. So we'll call this EC2 S3 access. Click on next step. Now here is where you have to select the role type. So an AWS service role. So this is where we would say, hey, we want, in this particular instance, an EC2 instance to get access to something. So this would be Amazon EC2 here, which allows EC2 instances to call AWS services on your behalf. So this role would allow an EC2 instance to call upon and use S3, assuming that it then has an S3 access policy attached. Also, there's roles for cross-account access, which we just talked about briefly, and also role for identity provider access. So this is, again, if you wanted to grant somebody access, temporary access to your AWS account that does not have an IAM user. So back to service roles, let's select our Amazon EC2 role. And again, that's the service that we want to have assume this role. And then we'll select the policy that we want to attach here, being S3 full access. So what we're doing now is taking an S3 access and we're assigning it to a role, and this being a role that can be applied to EC2. I'll then create the role. And we now have our EC2 S3 access role. And we can see here that the role itself has Amazon S3 full access attached to it. Now, and just kind of go with me on this, let's take a look and let's jump over to EC2. Now, we're going to get into EC2 later, so I'm just going to kind of speed through this process, so don't worry if you don't follow everything that I'm doing right now. I'm just doing this as an example. But as I go through the configuration process to provision an EC2 instance, we're going to get to this point here, step 3, where you're going to see IAM role. And we're going to now see that the role that I just created is now available for me to choose. This is where you assign the role to an EC2 instance during the creation process. And as I mentioned earlier, you can now change the role that is assigned to the EC2 instance later on by either using the CLI or by changing it in the EC2 management console. And so if you have an EC2 instance and you know that it is going to have to access information in an S3 bucket, or it's going to have to access information in some other AWS service or resource, you would create the role. Then during the creation process, you would come here and assign that role. And this is what allows an EC2 instance to assume that role with that policy attached, thus granting that EC2 instance the ability to access the S3 bucket. So again, we can now take a look here at our main diagram. And so far we have reviewed IAM users and groups and how IAM users and groups would access the S3 bucket through the console using IAM policies, as well now as how we would use a role and have an EC2 instance or have a non-AWS account holder assume a role to access an S3 bucket. So hopefully now this is becoming a little more clear, and we are now filling in the knowledge gaps for IAM and how all these different components are used. We do still have IAM API keys to talk about, and we will do that in the next lesson. So with that, we will conclude this lesson. Thank you for watching. You may now move on.